At 07:42 on May 27, 1940, Captain Jack Churchill crouched behind a crumbling stone wall near the French village of L'Epinette, watching 5 German soldiers advance through the morning mist toward his position. He was 33 years old, 14 years since graduating Sandhurst, with 0 confirmed kills in combat to his name. The Wehrmacht had already crushed Poland in just 36 days, and now their panzers were tearing through France at 40 miles per day, while the entire British Expeditionary Force ran for the sea. Churchill's company had lost 11 men in the past 72 hours alone. The Germans had better tanks, better aircraft, better coordination, and British soldiers were dying by the hundreds along every road leading to Dunkirk. The retreat had become a rout. Officers were burning classified documents in ditches, sergeants were burying equipment they couldn't carry, and private soldiers were throwing away their rifles just to run faster toward the coast. But Jack Churchill was not running. Instead, he was carrying a 6-foot English longbow with 70 pounds of draw weight and an effective range of 200 yards in the hands of an expert archer. And Churchill was an expert. He had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo just 11 months earlier, finishing 26th place out of 63 competitors from 14 nations. Not a champion, but good enough to put an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards. Good enough to kill a man before that man ever heard the shot. The German patrol was now at 30 yards. Close enough. Churchill could see the sergeant leading them, a veteran by the look of his careful movements, probably a man who had fought through the Polish campaign. The sergeant was scanning the hedgerow, checking windows, looking for the standard threats: rifles, machine guns, grenades. He never thought to look for a medieval weapon. Churchill drew the bowstring back to his ear. The yew-wood creaked under the tension. His fingers found the familiar anchor position on the string, the same position he had used 10,000 times in practice. He had made this exact shot countless times at targets, but he had never made it with a human being at the other end. The arrow flew. The German sergeant dropped without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his chest. It was the first confirmed longbow kill in a European war since the 17th century. It would be the last confirmed longbow kill of the entire Second World War. And it happened because one British officer refused to accept that modern warfare had made ancient weapons obsolete. The British Army did not know what to do with Jack Churchill. He had graduated from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926 and served with the Manchester Regiment in Burma, spending a decade learning to be a conventional infantry officer before quitting the Army entirely in 1936 because peacetime soldiering bored him to exhaustion. He had worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya. He had appeared in films as an archer and a bagpipe player, including a small role in The Thief of Baghdad. He had ridden motorcycles 1,500 miles across Burma and India, once crashing into a water buffalo on a rural road. When war broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined his regiment, but he did not rejoin as a normal officer. He brought his longbow, the same weapon he had used in international competition. He brought his Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries earlier, and he brought a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during his years in Burma. His fellow officers thought he was eccentric at best, mentally unstable at worst. His commanding officers thought he was a liability. The War Office had no regulation covering officers who wished to carry medieval weapons into battle against panzer divisions armed with 88mm guns. Churchill did not care what any of them thought. He had studied military history extensively and knew that modern rifles were more accurate than longbows at long range. He knew that a Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute, while a longbow could loose perhaps 10. But he also knew something that the tacticians in London had forgotten. In close combat, in the chaos of an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychological warfare mattered as much as raw firepower. A man charging at you with a broadsword and a Highland war cry was more terrifying than a man pointing a rifle from cover. And a man who could kill you silently with an arrow before you even knew he was there had an advantage that no amount of modern technology could match. The British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk between May 26 and June 4, 1940. Most of them left behind their weapons, their vehicles, their equipment, their pride. They came home defeated, exhausted, expecting a German invasion within weeks. Jack Churchill came home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had covered the retreat of his company, he had killed enemy soldiers with weapons that belonged in a museum, and he was just getting started. Within weeks of returning from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit that the War Office was secretly forming. They called themselves the Commandos. The training would be brutal beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted. The missions would be suicidal raids into Nazi-occupied territory. The casualty rates were expected to be catastrophic. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos said yes. By November 1941, the order came down from Combined Operations Headquarters. Number 3 Commando would lead a major assault on the German garrison at WWII, a small island on the Norwegian coast. The operation was codenamed Archery. The target was strategically important, controlling access to a network of fjords that German ships used to transport iron ore from Sweden. Churchill studied the intelligence reports obsessively. The German garrison was well-trained and well-equipped with machine guns, mortars, and prepared defensive positions. The coastal artillery could sink the landing craft before they even reached the beach. The attack would have to be fast, violent, and overwhelming. He requested permission to lead the first wave onto Malloy Island, a small fortified position guarding the approach to South WWII. Permission was granted. He requested permission to carry his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission was granted, though several senior officers questioned his sanity. At 08:45 on December 27th, the transport ships reached their launch position 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. The landing craft were lowered into the black water, and the commandos climbed down the cargo nets in full combat gear. Churchill took his position in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes in hand, sword at his belt. In 90 minutes, he would either be dead or legendary. The landing craft approached Malloy Island through a curtain of smoke, while the cruiser HMS Kenya fired salvos at the shore battery, her 6-inch guns thundering across the fjord. Churchill stood in the bow of the lead craft, fully exposed to enemy fire, while the other commandos crouched behind the steel gunnels. He had his bagpipes inflated and ready. The shore was 200 yards away, then 150, then 100. At 8:48, the ramp of Churchill's landing craft dropped onto the rocky beach of Malloy Island. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into the freezing surf and began playing the march of the Cameron men. The sound of the bagpipes cut through the explosions and gunfire like a blade through cloth. It was the most Scottish sound in the world, and it was coming from a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The Germans in the shore battery heard the bagpipes and could not believe what they were hearing. They had been trained to fight British soldiers with rifles and grenades, but they had not been trained to fight a madman playing music while walking calmly toward their guns. Churchill finished the tune, set down his bagpipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, screaming at his men to follow. The assault on Malloy Island took less than 10 minutes. Churchill led his men through the German positions systematically, clearing bunkers and gun emplacements one by one. The 4 coastal artillery guns were destroyed with explosive charges. The German commander was taken prisoner along with 15 of his men. By 0900, Malloy Island was secure. The raid on Vogsoy was the first major commando success of the war, proving that small, highly trained forces could strike deep into enemy territory and inflict serious damage. It proved that aggressive tactics and psychological warfare could overcome fortified positions. And it proved that Jack Churchill's medieval methods were not madness. They were effective. Word of Churchill's exploits spread through the British military. The officer who played bagpipes into battle, the madman with the broadsword. By the summer of 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando, and his next mission would take him to the beaches of Sicily, to the mountains of Italy, and to the most audacious prisoner capture of the entire war. On the night of September 14, 1943, during the fierce fighting at Salerno, Churchill received new orders. German forces had occupied the hills above the town of Molina, and an observation post on those hills was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. The observation post had to be eliminated. Churchill studied the terrain. A frontal assault up the hills would be suicidal. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach. He decided on a different approach. He would take a single corporal and infiltrate the German positions at night. 2 men could move silently where 200 could not. Churchill and the corporal left the British lines after midnight, moving through the darkness, using terrain features for cover. They avoided German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches and along stone walls. The night was black, and the Germans were not expecting an attack from 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. By dawn, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back down the hill to the British lines, the wounded Germans placed on carts and pushed by their fellow prisoners. By the spring of 1944, Churchill and No. 2 Commando were transferred to Yugoslavia to support partisan fighters against German occupation forces. In May, Churchill led an assault on the German-held island of Brač with 43 commandos and approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. The attack stalled when the partisans refused to advance. Churchill pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing, sword at his side, urging his men up the slope toward the German positions. A German mortar team had zeroed in on his position and fired a salvo of rounds directly into the group of commandos gathered around their commander. The explosions killed or wounded every man except Churchill himself. Churchill found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory, his men dead or dying around him, the Germans advancing toward his position. He did what any officer of his character would do. He sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, and began playing "Will Ye No Come Back Again," a Scottish lament, a song of farewell, a final act of defiance. The Germans approached cautiously, too confused and perhaps too respectful of a man who faced death with such composure to simply shoot him. A German grenade exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. The Germans transported Churchill to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of Berlin, convinced that anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister. They were disappointed to discover he had no connection to Winston Churchill and no access to strategic secrets. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For Jack Churchill, it was merely an inconvenience. Within 4 months, he escaped through a tunnel he and 4 other officers had dug, covering 110 meters under the fence. He and squadron leader Bertram James walked north for 2 weeks toward the Baltic coast, covering 200 kilometers on foot before being recaptured near Rostock. Churchill was transferred to a camp in Austria, then to Italy in April 1945, as the war was ending. When the SS guards abandoned the prisoners, Churchill did not wait for Allied forces to arrive. He walked 150 kilometers south through the Italian Alps, his ankle injured, with no food or weapons, until he reached American lines in Verona after 8 days. Jack Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. He proved that individual courage still mattered, that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower, and that one man with enough determination could accomplish what armies could not. His legacy lives on in every soldier who has ever been told that something was impossible and refused to believe it.